in this episode.
We can just continue that story when it comes to higher order, or more, I think enactivists like to say more complex cognitive processes that involve imagination, that involve memory, that involve mathematics, problem solving, and so forth. We can use similar notions that we use in sort of thinking about performance. We can use notions about affordances, for example, and think about, and people have started to talk about now, cognitive affordances. And in the book, I suggest we sometimes use concepts as affordance, an affordance to solve a problem. In the same way that we might use a certain strategy if we're trying to solve a math problem. And we would say, well, this strategy will afford one way to solve the problem, or I could take this other way. I could, use a different practice in order to solve the problem. But it seems to me that the way of describing what we're doing when we're doing something like math problem solving is very similar to what we're doing in terms of adjusting the environment. And in some cases, when we do math, that's exactly what we're doing. We're using pencil and paper. We're drawing graphs. This goes back to Charles Sanders Peirce, his idea that diagrams are really a kind of external way of thinking. The extended mind idea sort of was already there in Peirce in that respect. So how do we accomplish this higher order thinking or this more complex thinking? Oftentimes it's a kind of continuous process that we can relate to manipulating things out there in the environment, or starting to manipulate concepts in our head, so to speak. That seems very similar. We could have maybe imagined, what we do out here in the environment. We just kind of imagine doing it, and that helps us to solve the problem.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with philosopher Prof Shaun Gallagher, who works on phenomenology, enactivism, and embodied cognitive science. Enactivism is a philosophy of nature initially developed in theoretical biology and cognitive science that understands cognition to arise through organisms dynamically coupled to their environments, which themselves are in relation to other systems. For the enactivist, living beings enact their world. In other words, we are constantly participating in a world of meaning while simultaneously creating the world we're a part of. Here's Francisco Varela, one of the founders of the field, explaining it poignantly.
If we go back to what we were mentioning before, that knowledge is not, as we're used to believe, just an apprehension of the world out there, where you just fall in and then you take it in and you make a model, right? You process the information that the environment gives you. But in fact, that being in a world is a long process of co-evolution or co-definition between outside and inside. That means that the question is open of whether this way of bringing forth a world, as I like to say, is unique or there are multiple ones, right? For example, in the laboratory, this is one of the things that I study, is the world of colors and color vision, for a very good reason, which is that color is a very beautiful case study for this multiversality, because the way you and I, primates, see what we call color is not at all the way other species see it. You see, it's easy for human beings to understand that different cultures have a different view of what, say, beauty or justice is. And we have no problems in accepting that we live in a multiverse of social constructs. What I'm trying to show with this research, not just me, it's a few other people, I mean, this is not just my own trip, but that you can try and attempt to show with this line of research, is that this multiversality carries on all the way down to how you feel, how you perceive. That when you see a color, which is identical for all human beings, there is completely cross-cultural. Nevertheless, that is proper to humans. Now, the proper cross-cultural comparison is between humans and birds and fishes and insects. Because each one of these groups have something that is proper to call color vision, but is so different from ours that it cannot be accounted for as just another view of the same thing out there. It's in fact a different world, it's incommensurably different. For example, birds happen to have a different dimension in their color space. Now, that's a little technical, but the idea is that their colors is as diverse as ours, as we would be to a flat creature, to a creature that has only two dimensions. The third dimension in space is inconceivable for a flat creature. Now, birds, mind you, have another dimension of color. That is, it's not that they see more colors. It's not that they see better colors. It's that their color space is unimaginable for us. So that is again an example of another way of laying down a path for this stream of living things, which then gives them a world which we share, but at the same time it cannot be uniquely assigned as being theirs is the true one, ours is the false one, or vice versa. It is truly a multiverse. Now, that to me is one of the most fascinating concepts, I agree, because it says that when you walk around in the street, and I can see there the pigeons, and there's dogs walking about, and we are walking about, and children. Dogs happen to have a very simple color space. They're dichromats. We are trichromats, and the birds are probably even pentachromats. That's dimensionality grows up. Yet we're all walking around the canal there. We're all sharing something we can call a common ground. But this common ground is not something that it is pre-given. Each one of us has actually made it into a proper world. It's a multiversality. So ground is a very feminine quality of making something possible, instead of being a very masculine quality of the out there that you have to fit into.
Professor Gallagher is a leading scholar working on the enactive approach and has written myriad books on the topic, such as Embodied and Enactive Approaches to Cognition, Action and Interaction, and my personal favorite, Enactivist Interventions. I hope you enjoy this masterclass on enactivism after this quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you going to get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode. Yeah, as I was saying, Professor Gallagher, it's an honor to have you on the podcast, and in fact, meet you and break that almost parasocial barrier, because I've been, watching your lectures and listening to you on other podcasts for a while, so it's always a great experience doing this gig. But as we discussed through our email correspondences, what I really kind of want this to be is essentially almost like a masterclass on enactivism, enactivist thinking, the enactivist approach, and how it pertains to cognitive science, and then also, as you mentioned in your book, Enactivist Interventions, as a philosophy of nature. But I want to start off by just asking a very general question. For you, as a philosopher, Could you kind of tell us about your relationship with the enactivist approach? I mean, initially, you've done a lot of work on philosophical cognitive science. How did you come across enactivism, and then what influence has enactivism had on your own thinking?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it goes back quite a long way for me. In my PhD thesis, for example, I was using phenomenology especially, but I was using the kind of phenomenology that I learned from reading Merleau-Ponty, who was himself consulting with the empirical literature, so neurology especially, and the psychology of his day, developmental psychology. He was looking at experiments. And so when I was doing my PhD work, I also started to study. I took PhD seminars, in fact, in neuroscience and in physiological psychology. And I was reading specifically on topics that related to my thesis, which concerned embodiment and temporality. So back then, I think I was, in a sense, very much inclined to think in terms of embodied cognition. And I started publishing then a few papers around those themes. And then this was all in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, I was invited to a number of things that sort of put me in contact with cognitive science, which I really hadn't considered. I was really narrowly working, I would say, within the phenomenological tradition. Suddenly, cognitive science seemed to be something I thought was directly relevant to the kinds of studies that I had been doing. And I started to see that perhaps phenomenology could contribute something in some way to some of the cognitive sciences. But it was only later in the 1990s that I met Francisco Varela. And once I met him and became familiar with his work, that's, I think, when I was pretty convinced about the enactivist approach. In some sense, it made sense to me because I was working already sort of along that same line coming out of the work of Merleau-Ponty. So the connection between Merleau-Ponty and Varela seemed to me to be, a nice connection that I could make sense of. And that's how I started to get into the enactivist idea.
I'm interested in a bit of let's call it a sociological question, as it were. So, correct me if I'm wrong here, Varela really, in a way, was sort of introducing his ideas of enactivism and, then later on embodied cognition and then autopoiesis and whatnot as sort of to challenge this prevalent notion of cognitivism that was, prevalent in pernicious, really, in cognitive science and philosophy of cognitive science at the time, with this notion of representations where there's a entity out there in the world that your mind creates a representation of and whatnot. And the thing is, I mean, for me, I'm again really new to this whole world. It's only been the past few years, and wherever I looked, yes, there's this debate about representationalism and against non-representationalism and whatnot, but I don't see the cognitivist approach really in many places anymore. Even if I do see cognitivism, it is I would call it like a light vanilla cognitivism, or like maybe like with some kind of embodiment into it. So, this is, in other words, a simple way of me asking, how does the saying go? Have the tides shifted? Or anyway, have things changed since the time where Varela and that crew kind of introduced this notion where it seems like cognitivism is really out of fashion?
Well, I would like to say yes to that, except that I always meet people who are not quite convinced yet. about embodied cognition or enactivism. And so in some way, I would say it really depends on who you talk to. And there are certainly still plenty of people who are on board with the cognitivist program in philosophy, in science, and in a variety of sciences, including things like economics, for example. And I think that it might, and I've read just recently, a paper of a PhD student who's basically taking the same kind of cognitivist approach to explaining something like social cognition. So I don't think cognitivism is dead. I don't think that we've won a battle or anything like that. I do think that a lot more people, however, are considering the idea that embodiment has something to do with cognition, and some of those are looking at the enactivist approach. And so I find that in a number of disciplines, or we might say in terms of applications, there are a lot of people in other disciplines than philosophy coming and looking at what the philosophers are saying about enactivism or what the cognitive scientists are saying about enactivism, and they are trying to apply those ideas. So if you start looking at the literature, it looks like, enactivism is really expanding, and, going from one discipline to another and so forth, and being very successful. So I think there is something like that going on. But at the same time, there are definitely people who are not yet convinced. And that might be the fault of the enactivists, because I think in some way we haven't really provided anything like a knockdown argument against the notion of representation, for example. It's always possible, it seems to me, to develop an account of cognition in representationalist terms. And it makes perfect sense, given, if you're working in that tradition. So there's always that kind of response to the enactivists. And the enactivists, I think, have to work harder to perhaps convince people. But this is something like a transition or a transformation that maybe is generational. It takes a while. It takes a long time to work itself into our thinking about and our ways of doing science. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you for...
I hope that makes sense.
No, it did. I mean, obviously, this is not like something you can answer off the back of your head. Like, it probably requires some kind of social science where you, survey people working in cognitive science and ask them these questions. It probably could be measured empirically. But I mean, the reason I asked that was because, even in my own university department, like whenever I talk to people who are either doing PhDs or, in fact, professors and, associate professors, whenever we have this discussion, there's always some notion of, yes, some of them may even be representationalists. However, they do take this notion of embodiment and kind of this relationship between the body and our environment quite seriously. It's not this almost Cartesian, abstract kind of the cogito kind of way of thinking. But yeah, that's very, very, very interesting. And this is again why I really do still feel that it's a fledgling field, despite it being introduced in the 1990s and even earlier with like phenomenology and whatnot. Excellent. All right. So given that we've kind of got that bit of that interesting history of enactivism out of the way, let's just, for the listener here, can you just simply put, outline what is enactivism?
Yeah. So I think one way to start thinking about enactivism is something it shares with a number of other approaches, which emphasize the fact that we should not just think of cognition totally in terms of brain processes. We should rather think of brain, body, and environment as a kind of system. And the important aspects here are the way these these things like brains, bodies, and environments are coupled. And one, in that respect, the enactivist takes a dynamical systems approach, which basically says something like this: if you change one of those things, if you go in and you start messing about with the brain, then all of the dynamics start to change, the dynamical relationship between brain and body, and between body and environment. But in a similar way, if you go and start changing, intervening in some way on bodily processes, you could also change brain and our experience of the environment. And if you start changing the physical environment, you also get some kind of changes in brain and body. So these things are linked in a very intricate, intertwined way, so that if you change one, you're going to change in a certain way the coupling, the relationality. And I think that's part of what enactivism emphasizes, the relationality of in the system. It's a little bit tricky with the environment, because you can think of the environment as something just physical, but coming from a more phenomenological perspective, one can think of the environment as the lived environment or the experienced environment, which is not just the physical stuff out there, but also is involved with social and cultural processes and practices. So the environment is one thing that is somewhat complex in terms of how we ought to think of it. And if we're thinking along this line of brain, body, environment, then how we define the mind as an embodied mind is just in terms of those coupling processes. And to the extent that those coupling processes depend on body and brain and environment. So at least that might be a very broad way of talking here. But I think definitely the enactivists are working within that framework and trying to spell out some of the details of how that must work. This is not an easy kind of thing to do, especially given that there is already an established vocabulary, and the enactivists are in some way trying to develop their own vocabulary. And there, one can only try to make one's thinking more precise as you go along. This, of course, also involves looking at the empirical work, experiments, and so forth, trying to make precise what we mean by something like an affordance or something like being attuned to the environment. These are like different kinds of terms that we're using to describe this. And I think we have to become more precise in terms of what those terms mean.
Indeed. And I think it's ongoing work, as a matter of fact. So I really want to see if we can flesh out, in this case you really can flesh out this notion of it being a philosophy of nature. Now, again, for me, as someone of a novice or neophyte to this whole field, I always thought of enactivism in relation to neuroscience and cognitive science. In fact, for me, it very much came off as like a scientific theory, because all the material that I read are always referring to like some kind of scientific work, some kind of scientific study. So it's very much, in fact, Varela himself was a scientist. He was a biologist and a neuroscientist. But then in your book, in Enactivist Interventions, you argue that it's in fact a philosophy of nature, and you even use the work of Peter Godfrey Smith, the Australian philosopher of science, to kind of try and outline your point here. So, yeah, could you perhaps flesh out why you believe and why you claim that enactivism should be taught more as a philosophy of nature over, I'm not sure if this is really what you're saying, over a scientific theory per se, or, well, perhaps could it be both?
Yeah, definitely. I think it can be both. In some way, enactivist thinking can inform science, and you can think of it as already doing that in some of the programs that have been developed by people like Varela. So the idea of neurophenomenology, as you say, he was a biologist, a neurobiologist, and he did real experiments. Neurophenomenology was at least one of the approaches that he used to try to develop his enactivist thinking. There are other, I've proposed something called front-loaded phenomenology, which is just a slight variation on how we can use something like phenomenology in doing empirical experiments. But those are, I think, ways that enactivism can sort of contribute to the science. And so in that sense, I think it can inform a scientific agenda. The idea of enactivism as a philosophy of nature, which I suggested, really is not something that sort of is a separate idea. It's very closely tied to the question of how you think of doing science in a kind of naturalistic fashion, of course, and what naturalism means, what nature means within that framework. So this is a question actually that goes back again to Merleau-Ponty in his very first book, The Structure of Behavior. He talked about the notion of nature and the idea that we maybe have to rethink the whole concept of nature. What exactly do we mean by nature? And of course, if we just take a kind of scientific naturalism and you say, well, we think of nature as this kind of objective thing out there that we are trying to study and manipulating so that it sort of gives up its secrets and so forth. That kind of objectivist conception of nature is the type of thing that Merleau-Ponty was trying to rethink. And if we start to think along the enactivist way of enacting our environments and basically our nature of being embodied as itself being part of nature, then again with Merleau-Ponty, this is a different way of thinking about nature from the kind of scientific naturalism of objectifying nature. That, to me, that sort of suggests that we could think of enactivism as a rethinking of how we do science, as a rethinking of the mind, also as a rethinking of what we mean by nature, and to what extent nature is, or what extent the mind is part of nature, and what that would mean.
Yeah, brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that part of the book, and if I may kind of go on a bit of a speculative point here, this is also why I kind of get annoyed when I kind of hear I feel like sometimes people frame the question the wrong way, where yes, if you view nature or the material world as like this mechanical world, in this Cartesian sense, and all coming from someone like Francis Bacon, sure, then probably it does problematize this kind of inactivist way of thinking, and then that's when people suddenly leap into things like idealism, and they're like, okay, the nature, it's all mind, everything is mind, or something like that. And for me, that's like kind of like, if I may put it a bit crudely, loose kind of thinking, where it's like you haven't even clearly defined the axioms or the framework as to how you're asking these questions. And what I appreciate about enactivism is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, so Ezekiel de Palo, the person who wrote the book The Linguistic Bodies, and a fantastic thinker, I really enjoy reading his stuff, and he kind of mentions enactivism is still very much a materialist theory. It's something that's you can speak of enactivism and you can use an activist approach while being a materialist without having any kind of penchant towards like mysticism or any of this like new age kind of stuff, it can still speak of the fact that we live in a material world, and the world we live in. But of course, it does kind of take perhaps reformulating what we mean by the material world. So on that note, I'm curious if I could ask you this kind of speculative question: where do you stand in this it's a very popular debate online, really, materialism versus idealism, and all these really speculative questions, like metaphysical questions, really. As an activist thinker, where do you find, do you think this debate it's like a useless debate, or where do you sit on this whole debate of, materialism versus idealism, and then I guess panpsychism and all the other different isms that come up in this conversation?
Yeah. I can definitely say I'm not a panpsychist, so it's one thing I can be clear about. And I'm not sure I could sort of outline a set of reasons why I would go that way. But anyway, this really does tie in to just those questions about nature that we were talking. And we can ask, what do we mean by the material world? Certainly, it's a physical world that we have to deal with. We are physical creatures. We have bodies. Bodies are sort of playing an important role in our ability to think about the world and to engage in action in that world. So we are, in a certain sense, part of that material world, and that's a good starting point. But at the same time, we seem to, well, I'm going to use a term that is a little tricky, but actually, Merleau-Ponty said this about language. He said that language in some way transcends the body. And it's not that he meant that it leaves the body behind, but it might be better to think of it as saying that language carries the body, further into kind of cultural set of practices and communications with others. So if we start thinking about our interactions with other people, not just in terms of language, but in terms of action and the formation of habits and the formation of social institutions. And there's a lot there to talk about. But if we think in those terms, then, well, are we saying that those are features that transcend the material world? And I don't actually want to say that, because it sounds like it's there's something spooky about it. But in some way, those are in those phenomena that are tied to sociality and to the generation of meaning and so forth. Those are things that, in a certain way, are irreducible just to purely material processes. This is, of course, a challenge to try to explain how all of this works, but this is part of what the enactivists are trying to do when, for example, they talk about social cognition. And Ezekiel Apollo, as you say, is talking about language here. So I think, we are trying to say things that means we are not naive materialists. At the same time, materialism is where we start, and it's I guess how we would test our ideas as well.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Yeah. That last bit, how you verify your ideas and test your ideas, is really important for me, because I guess I take somewhat of a Wittgensteinian approach to language, where I find, especially, it's for lack of a better term, sexy to talk about panpsychism. It's, it gets people turning that, consciousness and all these huge questions. But I find that there's something even rather narcissistic about that way of thinking, where you think that the whole universe is something like the mind. So you kind of enter, it's a very anthropocentric way of thinking. And what I appreciate about the enactivist thinkers and even the kind of the big thinkers in the field is they, first of all, they're very scientifically oriented and they try to verify their theories through science and other means too, like social science and whatnot. But also, they still, and again, I mean, Ezekiel de Paulo makes this point that the difference still lies that there is something called the material world. Not everything is the mind. Not everything is an extension of your whatever consciousness experience or whatever. There's still a difference, but that difference is perhaps viewed, for lack of a better term, dialectically, if I may say. But yeah, that was great. Thank you for that, Professor Gallagher. Now, one important part, of course, I want to talk about phenomenology. That's a huge part of kind of the enactivist approach. But before that, in a couple of places, you did mention the body, and I kind of wanted to see if we could flesh out the concept of the body as you would understand it as in the enactivist approach. Now, yeah, I mean, yeah, firstly, if I may just put it really plainly, what is the body in the enactivist approach? Because, I mean, I guess if I could say, there's even things like enactivist robotics. I mean, that's like a physical, you're trying to give a computational system or some kind of machine a physical body, and there are people like Rodney Brooks who's done like really fascinating work. I love reading about that stuff. But I don't know, I've read, like, when I see, for instance, Merleau-Ponty, when he speaks of the body, it's not the physical body really, it's something a bit different. But can you just kind of, again, in your view at least, when you speak of the body, how do you conceptualize that concept, that notion?
Yeah, so I think this has to do with the connection between enactivism and phenomenology. So in phenomenology, and in people like Merleau-Ponty, but even before him, in Husserl, for example, and some of the other phenomenologists, you have this distinction between what they call the lived body and the objective body. And those are, in a certain way, two perspectives on embodiment. It's not that we have two different bodies or anything like that, but we could take an objective perspective on our own body, treating it as almost an object. For example, in a medical examination, that's might be something that we be doing. Or if we have a certain pain, we might start to treat our body in a very objective way. So that's one attitude or one perspective on the body. But then, to be able to even do that, we have to be already living in our body, experiencing our body. So some people talk about the experience of sort of being inside the body, but I think that's not the right way to talk about it. My body is, in a certain sense, coextensive with me in some fashion. And that lived body is probably the notion of a body that plays a role in the enactivist view. And yet it's something still that can be studied from an objective perspective. So again, we might say the lived body is the kind of first person perspective that we take on our own body. We experience our body as being our own body. So we have a sense of ownership for our body. When we do things, we have a sense of agency for doing those things. A lot of this has to do with proprioception, interoception, a lot of processes that are, in fact, bodily processes that can be studied from a more objective perspective. So we can do science and study, and we're studying the same body that we are in a certain way living. So it's not, again, as I say, it's not that we have two bodies, but we can take different perspectives on the body and study it in a number of different ways. So I think that the body is something that plays a role in cognition, and we're asking as enactivists exactly how we can investigate that and exactly what are the roles that the body plays. And we can do that experimentally. we can do that by using empirical science. This as well as keeping in mind the phenomenological perspective of this being a body that we are, in fact, experiencing.
Indeed. But also within, as you say, embedded or situated in a culture, in an environment, within language, and all these other factors that factor into it. If you put it that way. Excellent.
That's right.
I feel like I should just ask you again this very basic, naive question, just to get the definitions clear. When you say cognition, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think of it in terms of human cognition, which is something that I myself experience as someone who perceives the world and thinks about things. There's a wider, let's say, a wider sense of cognition that some enactivists like to talk about, where cognition means something like a very basic responding to the environment, so that even a bacterium, right, is cognitive in that very wide sense. To the extent that we respond intelligently, where intelligently means relative to the kind of organism that we are, to the extent that we respond intelligently to the environment, cognition is there. So that's a very basic idea of cognition. In that sense, as people like Evan Thompson would argue, bacteria are cognitive in some way. My own interest, however, is, although I think animal cognition is a good topic to look at, definitely. I've had students who worked in that area. I think my own interest is in human cognition. It's a very much more complex, to me, much more challenging to think of. And so cognition for me means primarily that. We're talking about the human sort of cognition. And that includes certain traditional categories: perception, imagination, memory, right? All of these different aspects that we treat under the heading of cognition. That's all included there.
Yes, certainly. I mean, again, I think the big challenge with humans is this factor that we have this annoying thing called culture and the social and the environment that but of course you can make that argument with animals too, but there's something a lot more for lack of a better term complicating about humans, or confusing about humans.
In my
go ahead.
I just give you an example. In my undergraduate classes, I sometimes challenge my students to think about what it would be like to experience the world as a frog experiences it, right? So I say, here, put a frog right here on the table, and what do you think the frog sees? And I think the usual, thing that an undergraduate or anyone might just say is that, well, the frog sees the world that we see. But in fact, that seems very unlikely, given that the structure of the frog's eye is completely different from ours, as well as the structure of the frog's brain and the structure of the frog's body. It's a completely different system. So why should we assume that the frog perceives the same world that we perceive? So this is an idea that goes back to the theoretical biologists like von Huskel, but it's really sort of inspired by the Kantian idea, of the distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal world, right? So we can say that the frog lives in a different phenomenal world than we live in, and this would be also the idea, the Umwelt in von Huskel, a different Umwelt, a different environment in a certain sense, experienced environment, and then we can say, well, the human lives, then in a different world from the frog. And then we can ask the Kantian question: well, which of these worlds is closer to the way the world really is? And we might be inclined to say, oh, of course, the human, but that's that's not quite clear. Why would the human world, the world as we experience it with our body and our brain and our eye structure, have to be closer to the way the world really is? And that whole question becomes something of a challenge for the students to try to think through. And
no doubt. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, personally, for me, I feel like it's a perennial problem in philosophy and even science, because it touches obviously even how we do science. But I mean, it's really interesting you said that, because obviously the famous paper by Nagel, "What's it like to be a bat?" and he kind of tries to make this point, and then Wittgenstein. I mean, in fact, I'm very much a Wittgensteinian, where he kind of talks about, even if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand them. And this notion, and this again is why I am drawn a lot towards the enactivist approach, because I don't like these huge metaphysical questions and trying to like just posit, everything is consciousness, everything in a panpsychism, whatever. Because it's like, do we even have to talk about those things? Like, for me, it's like in language, it's kind of like what works. That's the real thing at the moment in a very localized setting. And again, as you outline in like this notion of, what is real? That is that Kantian question, which even Husserl took on, and then it's still going on, I feel. Excellent. So I'm curious, so when you do posit that question to your students, generally, what kind of interesting answers have you gotten?
They are, to that precise question of, which world is closer to the way things are in themselves. First of all, the immediate response is, I don't know. And of course,
which is probably a good question, a good answer.
Yeah. This is the beginning of philosophy, when we can say, I don't know something, we want to pursue it. And I tell them also that, well, I don't have the right answer to that either, but we should continue to think of it. But this ties in, I think, to some claims by enactivism, which talk about enacting the world. And in some respects, people have understood this to be sort of anti-realist, that it's more, we somehow or other construct the world in a way, and this runs into sort of ontological questions about realism versus constructivism and so forth. But that's something that we can start talking about in to follow up that kind of question. What exactly does our body bring to this? What does our body do in terms of shaping the way that we understand or conceive of or perceive the world? So it gets into a good discussion, but there's no answer that really makes a clear, definitive definition of which of these worlds is the right one.
No doubt, of course. Excellent. I mean, okay, there's like a lot more I want to get into. I want to get into autopoiesis and then kind of discuss this big debate around representationalism. However, before that, I'm really interested in chapter 3, Professor, of Enactivist Interventions, where you talk about pragmatism. And I do find that there's it's a rich tradition now, the pragmatic kind of American pragmatic way of thinking. And even though I haven't done as much reading into pragmatism as much as I wanted to, I have read a lot of Wittgenstein and then even Robert Brandon. But can you kind of talk about, what you identified in the book, and then maybe since you've written the book and your other work, the relationship between pragmatism, the tradition or the school of pragmatism, if I could say that, and kind of the enactivist approach? What are the relations you see between these two fields?
Yeah, so in terms of the history of this, I would say that enactivism made good use of phenomenology. So people like Varela, when he was starting to think of this, was influenced by people like Merleau-Ponty, and even later by Husserl when he started to work with other people and started to understand Husserl. He also, I think, was very much influenced by Dreyfus. But all of that is phenomenology, and I don't think people were actually talking about pragmatism until around 2000. I would say 2008, when a number of people started to publish about the possible connection between pragmatism and enactivism.
Yeah.
And I think before that, people weren't really talking about it, and the enactivists weren't really saying much about pragmatism. But it does make a lot of sense in terms of to me, the similarity between someone like John Dewey and Merleau-Ponty. I think there are connections between pragmatism and phenomenology, and that's a way to sort of start to see connections between pragmatism and activism. So the work of John Dewey, for example, to me, once you start reading Dewey, you find a lot of enactivist ideas there. But you can go back even further to Charles Sanders Peirce and find that he himself was really talking about the role of embodiment, the role of the environment. So that's one thing I believe that the pragmatists share with the enactivists, a real emphasis upon the role of the environment and the way we are bodily coupled to the environment. So Dewey, for example, has this phrase, organism environment, hyphenated. And it seems to me that that's very much the kind of thing that the enactivists want to talk about. Dewey also, I think, emphasizes the action component of cognition. What is cognition for? It seems to me Dewey would say it's really about problem solving in a certain sense, and that means that cognition is for action. Again, an enactivist theme there. So when you start looking at the details, then you find some connections. So Richard Minari is someone who has done some work in this area, and he's pointed out, especially looking at Charles Sanders Peirce and his concept of representation, which is a kind of alternative conception to the kind of mainstream cognitive science conception of representation. And Morrie has suggested this is perhaps something of use to embodied and enactivist approaches. But I think I think Minari was one of the first to write about enactivism and pragmatism or embodied cognition. And I think that he published around that time of 2008, and ever since that time, a good number of people have been pointing out and exploring the connection here between these two different traditions. I think there's a lot more work to do as well on this, but definitely it has been something people have explored.
Indeed. I mean, in the book, you speak also of, this is something I really enjoyed reading, Dewey's notion of a situation.
Yeah. That seems to me to be, again, a very enactivist idea, that what Dewey calls the situation is not just the objective environment that surrounds us, but it includes ourselves. That is to say,
exactly.
The situation is defined by the agent and the environment. So any change in the agent changes the situation as much as any change in the environment changes it. Yeah. So I think
Yeah,
that's a way to think about that close connection between organism and environment.
indeed. I mean, at first it kind of seems a bit like almost like a contradiction to state, but then once you start seeing in terms of this as a relational aspect, you gotta kind of use a different framework to view that problem, as it were. And as you mentioned, yes, even Richard Menery here, Professor Menery is great. He taught a philosophy unit at our university, and I really enjoyed reading. Well, he's a great lecturer, but also I really enjoyed reading his paper, Mathematical Cognition, a case of enculturation. And you refuted that paper in the book too, which I really do want to discuss. That's the last chapter in the book, kind of the abstract thinking as it pertains to enactivism. Great, awesome. Thank you for that, Professor. All right, so since we've kind of discussed the pragmatism, I mean, look, this could probably be a whole episode just discussing pragmatism and activism, so I don't want to get too bogged down in that. The other big concept, of course, that I have to ask you when we talk about enactivism is autopoiesis. This, again, is like a whole theory or even set of theories on its own, which relates to many questions, and all the way from philosophy to biology to cybernetics and so on. But yeah, can you talk about the concept of autopoiesis as Varela and I forgot his mentor that they developed it, and then how it pertains to the enactivist approach?
Yeah. So Maturana is his mentor. So Maturana and Varela worked together. They were working in Chile, and they were both neurobiologists, and so they were interested, precisely in biology and in a sense, definition of life. How should we conceive of life? And so they proposed this notion of autopoiesis, which means something like self-producing, quite literally, self-producing. The idea that a biological entity, cell or an organism, is something that self-organizes in such a way to keep itself going. That's what they were trying to work out in biological terms. This, for Maturana, was very much a biological concept, and as I understand it, Maturana wasn't really inclined to sort of take that concept and apply it, more broadly, but Varela was. He thought, well, this is a concept that perhaps could be used to allow us to think about cognition as well. So he wanted to sort of carry that idea from biology into cognitive science, and this is part of how we get to enactivism. People have suggested that maybe it's even a good model for our understanding of the social world, and then that's where one stops. Using that model is not clear, but it is a nice model for the enactivists. Ezekiel DiPaolo, who you mentioned before, has a role here, because one thing he realized was that in the original theory of autopoiesis, there was no mention of the idea of adaptation. That exactly the question is, how does the organism, which is autopoietically maintaining itself, how does it relate to the environment? And there was the idea only that it sort of drew energy from the environment. In some way, DiPaolo wanted to say, but it also responds to the environment and adapts to the environment. And then we start to think about the organism-environment relations in such a way that we get a better story. So I think DiPaolo has added to the theory of autopoiesis in a way that really helps the enactivist idea and supports this whole notion of the body environment relationship.
Indeed, yeah. It's fascinating. I mean, yeah, when I came across autopoiesis, in fact, because I haven't got a background in biology, my head really went into more like sociology. I mean, I was thinking of even like a society, or I mean, nowadays you could certainly say this for a corporation. A corporation seems like it's in this like self recreating, self productive kind of way, perhaps more towards the destructive end of things. And I find that quite interesting too. But yeah, there's a lot to say there. So I kind of want to see if how much we can push the concept. I mean, you say in the book that enactivism is a philosophy of nature. In the same way, can we take the concept of autopoiesis and kind of push it to be some kind of, I don't know, philosophy of nature, or even some kind of like neo-materialist kind of way of thinking about reality as such? Or is that probably pushing it a bit too much?
I think that in some regard, this is what Merleau-Ponty was attempting to do in his later work. So there's a set of lectures that he gave I think he gave them at the Collège de France or the Sorbonne, but these are the lectures on nature. And there he cites some work by embryologists who are clearly working on very basic biology and trying to understand how embryos kind of self-organize, how they develop. And some of the principles that he was looking at in their work start to inform his thinking about about ontology. So when he's thinking about nature, how these very basic processes are sort of built in to natural development in organisms, this becomes something of a model for him when he, in his last unfinished work, The Visible and the Invisible, tries to develop an ontology that goes along with that. And this is an ontology that definitely is unorthodox. It's not panpsychism, but it's not your ordinary type of ontology either of objective nature and so forth. So in some sense, I think your question is a good one, because I think that someone like Merleau-Ponty was already trying to develop that type of idea. Now, he did not have the theory of autopoiesis, but it seems to me that some of the embryologists who he was reading did come close to something like the idea of self-organizing aspects of embryonic development. Interesting to this is that the embryologists he was reading were working in the U.S. With John Dewey. Dewey was one of their mentors and one of the people was working with. They were all working with a developmental psychologist named Rahul who was doing a lot of very interesting work, experimental work with babies, and this I think would have very much interested Merleau-Ponty, but he never made the connection. That is to say, I don't think he knew of Murnau-McGraw's work or that John Dewey was in sort of hovering in the background. But the embryologists were influenced by Dewey, and Dewey was working with them. This was in the 1930s, and this was the material that, some of the material that Merleau-Ponty was reading in the early 50s when he was writing these lectures on nature. So there's a project there that is really, I think, fascinating. A lot of work could be done on that. And so that's something I'm still interested in.
No doubt. So just to remind me again, Professor, where does Merleau-Ponty write of this? Is it in the Phenomenology of Perception or some of his other lectures on nature, you said, where he talks of the embryology and whatnot?
Yeah, this is in Lectures on Nature. That's the name of the book, Lectures on Nature.
Excellent. I'll be ordering that today. Yeah, it's fascinating, all these connections, as you point out. Yeah, I mean, if only they had the internet and Twitter before it became a Nazi hellhole, so that they could have connected online. It would have been just amazing to see what these thinkers would have done together and in their intersections. Brilliant.
Yeah. Also, I mean, it's a shame that Merleau-Ponty smoked too much and he died young of lung cancer.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, but then who didn't?
He could have. Yeah, right. Yeah. But he could have lived another, 20 years and maybe met Varela. So that would have been cool,
a fascinating meeting of worlds. Yeah. But then also, who didn't smoke too much back in the day? So that's it's a fun little thing.
In France.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, it's funny. I was even telling my partner. I mean, I don't smoke, but whenever I visit Paris, I'd like to pretend like I smoke because I feel like smoking there, even though I don't even like smoking, and having my my black coffee. In any case, be that as it may, all right. The other topic I want to discuss with you is this. Now, I think it's really getting a lot of attention with the whole AI stuff and all of that. This active inference. And the free energy principle. So even in the book, you do touch on, there's one section where you discuss the FEP in the chapter Perception Without Inferences. But yeah, through an activist approach, because I'm still trying to see the connections, because obviously in many ways, I mean, one could say enactivism is really a non-representationalist model of cognition and a way of thinking. But with active inference, I mean, it's really a schema which you can apply. I mean, if it's predictive coding with this FEP, and in active inference, you can have both. You can even have a representationalist view, but also some might argue, a dynamic, non-representationalist view. But, in active inference, they use generative models and whatnot. But, I mean, where do you see in this debate, like, what insights do you think the enactivist approach may have to the field of active inference and kind of theoretical neuroscience, in these kind of current discussions that are ongoing?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and a number of people have weighed in on this. So there are some people who are arguing from the perspective of predictive processing, active inference approaches, the energy principle ideas, who are saying, actually, this is very, very much in line with the way enactivists think. And then you have others on the enactivist side, including DiPaolo and Evan Thompson, who are saying, no, really, there are some differences that we have to be careful about. But even they kind of leave it open a bit. And I think that's where it is right now. It's a kind of open question. The idea of active inference is quite a bit closer to the enactivist idea than the original kind of internalist model of predictive processing that you get in Jacob Howie, for example. So I think Howie, proposes something that is highly representational, highly internalist, and in that respect, Andy Clark goes a little bit closer to embodied cognition, where Howie just says embodied cognition is off the table. Clark thinks, well, this idea can be put together with extended mind and embodied cognition, at least in that respect. And, Clark is somewhat in between the enactivists and the more internalist story, right? Because he still wants to talk a little bit about representations. But the emphasis on active inference, I think, is really about embodied movement, changing the environment, rather than changing our model, changing the environment to fit our model, if that's what we have. And the enactivists would take it a little bit further to say active inference is really the way to think about all of this predictive mind idea. And prediction is not something that is foreign to the enactivist idea. You have people who work in embodied cognition often emphasizing the anticipatory nature of the motor system when we are planning our actions and carrying through and controlling our action. That is really about predicting and having feedback, proprioceptive feedback from our bodily movement and so forth. So there are models there that I think are quite consistent with the enactivist view, and could be consistent with the more predictive processing view. It's just really about how far removed you can get predictive processing from the more internalist representationalist story. How far can you bring it over into the more enactive? And here, I think it's interesting that Friston, Carl Friston, who is sort of the guru of predictive processing, free energy principle, and so forth.
Fringe principle, yeah.
I over dinner one night, I said I have a hypothesis, and it's that the only thing you really care about is the mathematics. And he said that's true. And I came to that because he seemed to be able to write with, to co-author with people like Hoey and with Clark and with the enactivists. And it seems like that part of it, the philosophical or psychological part of it, is not the important thing for him. It's the math. As long as we have the good math, then he's happy. And then it's about how the philosophers interpret it, and that's their problem, I guess.
Indeed, yeah. I've got a few things to say here. I spoke to this researcher called Mel Andrews, and their point wrote a really good paper on the free energy principle, and Mel was comparing Carl Friston to more of a Newton than an Einstein, because Einstein was kind of like a philosopher. He was asking these fundamental questions, whereas Newton, even though he had his esoteric interests in theology and whatnot, when he came to the science, he was just doing his calculations. He was just a completely mathematical machine, and Mel was saying Carl Friston's more of a Newton than an Einstein. But that's fascinating. But also, as you mentioned, because as I do my own study and research in active inference, I don't even think too much about this whole representationalism debate, because what really the way I take the enactive approach when it comes to active inference is this notion of action, because especially, let's call it, juxtaposing with the current contemporary LLM-based AI kind of paradigm. One thing I really appreciate in the artificial intelligence world, when you introduce this notions of concepts from active inference, is that intelligence is not about abstract computation or abstract kind of theorizing, but it involves action and an agent acting in the world, and where you make predictions, and then there's a discrepancy between what you observe, and then after that you change your priors and your perceptions as you get feedback from the world. And one really interesting point Mahal Albrasian made, who's also an active inference researcher, was she said that in a way, the moment an agent stops acting, the agent just dies. There's no, the moment an agent attempts to reduce free energy or reduce surprise, and when that stops, the agent that ends. That's the end of the agent's being in the world. And I find that very much an inactive concept, in the sense that when we think of an inactive system, it has to be seen in this dynamic coupling, and the moment that coupling, I guess, disappears, so does the whatever the thing, the agent, the system. So yeah, again, as you say, there's a lot we could get into there, but fascinating. And I do appreciate that you say that yeah, it can be seen through different lenses, philosophical lenses. But I'm assuming, though, I mean, if I may ask, you probably still do take an enactive approach to as to how you view the work being done in FEP and active inference, correct?
Yes, yeah, I'm definitely on that side of things, and I don't think it's a finished story. I think there's a lot more work to be done, but that's the way
Indeed.
I'm leaning at this point. Yeah.
Indeed. Fascinating.
Mm.
All right. So on that note, the other question I wanted to bring up, in fact, I have a lot more, and I will see how much I can get through with the time we have, Professor, is ecological psychology. And I'm gonna admit right off the bat, I haven't done a lot of reading on Gibson's work. I've just read like Wikipedia articles really on ecological psychology, and whatever I've read with these notions of affordances and whatnot. I mean, like, oh, this is just like enactivism. Like, I just see all of enactivism, and I'm like, so in a way, what I'm trying to figure out is, in fact, where are the differences between ecological psychology and the enactivist approach? Because they seem to me is just using different language to speak of the same phenomena. So, firstly, yeah, could you kind of just broadly speaking outline the similarities in the relationship, and then if there are any significant differences, could you also please kind of maybe flesh them out too between enactivism and ecological
Yeah.
psychology?
Yeah, it's definitely the case that the enactivists borrow quite heavily from the ecological psychology tradition, Gibson's work especially. And what they borrow are things like concepts like affordance, direct perception. They see those work, they work very well with the enactivist idea. And that makes a lot of sense because I think Gibson was at least partially inspired by his reading of Merleau-Ponty. Tony Chimero has made this point and so forth. So it's kind of they're close cousins in some way. Gibsonian psychology and enactivism. But it depends on who you talk to now because there are some Gibsonians who basically argue that enactivism and ecological psychology are not that close, that there are some differences. And sometimes it's just, to me, it seems like it's a quibble, a little bit of a quibble about the nature of coupling and relationality, how we understand affordances to the extent that affordances are relational. That seems to be the way enactivists want to think about it. But then there is also maybe a deeper kind of ontological question about this, what we mentioned before, about realism versus constructivism, right? For the Gibsonians, they would say information actually exists out there in the environment. So the environment is there already, pre-established in a certain fashion. And it's that information that somehow or other comes into play in our cognitive life. Whereas I think the enactivists want to, talk more about the relationality of this, that, what counts as information. Information is not objectively out there, but what counts as information will depend upon the nature of the organism, the interests of the perceiver, the background of the perceiver, prior experience, historicity, and so forth. So I guess there can be quibbles, but there can be a kind of deeper disagreement, and how to resolve that would be part of an ongoing discussion. There are a few other things too. For example, the notion of resonance has been used by both ecological psychologists and enactivists, where people they want to talk about sort of the idea that there's a kind of the brain resonates as a way of describing what how this coupling happens. But again, a debate about the nature of resonance seems to be whether it's something like a one-way influence of the environmental information on what's happening in the brain, or I think the enactivists would want to say there's a kind of reciprocity. There's something like a two-way process here that we would want to call resonance. And it's, that might, well, again, I'm not quite sure if that's a quibble or a really fundamental difference. But yeah, these are some of the differences, at least, that the ecological psychologists want to point to. And the enactivists, I suppose, are trying to work out whether their conceptions are more Gibsonian than the Gibsonians. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure, where that all is going to end up. But again, these are like open questions. So, in all of these cases where the predictive processors are there, the Gibsonians are there, and the enactivists are trying to define their position with respect to those other approaches, and that means we're still kind of have a set of open questions and more work to do.
Indeed, I like what you said about the enactivists trying to figure out if they're more Gibsonian than Gibson himself. And this is one thing I love about doing this podcast when I speak to scholars like yourself, who they take a thinker from the past and they've studied them pretty much most of their academic life. And then in a way, they become more of that thinker than even the original thinker itself. Mm-hmm. And so I see this happen a lot to Merleau-Ponty, Husserl. I mean, Husserl, I think, in fact, in a way, I forget where Merleau-Ponty says this. I read this somewhere, that he kind of really saw himself continuing or radicalizing Husserl's project. So I see this happen in philosophy and even science quite a lot. Fascinating. Excellent. Thank you for that, Professor. So the other really fun chapter I read in this book, this is, again, a huge question in philosophy and discussed, I could even say ad nauseum, really, the question of free will. It's, there were some best-selling books written by philosophy popularizers on free will and whatnot. But then, you do, in the book, you do kind of, firstly, you outline that, you say, firstly, when we think of free will, this kind of neuroscience approach with people like Libet and his experiments, that I think we're asking the wrong question about free will. You say that free will has to do with intentionality, and then you even, in a very systematic way, outline this, where if there's a lizard in the grass and then it touches your feet, and then you decide to catch that lizard, where does the free will lie? So anyway, there's a lot there. So, of course, to the listener, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole chapter here. Read the book. But I'm curious, from like an activist approach. First of all, again, put plainly, how would you perhaps formulate this question of free will, this huge question of philosophy, coming through the enactivist approach?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. I think I'm not sure if I do that in the book or in some paper someplace, but I suggest that it might be better to shift away from the terminology of free will, because it has such a long history and people, a lot of baggage with it, and use another term which may also have its own baggage. Nonetheless, I think the concept of autonomy might be something more productive to think about. But I do really like thinking about these issues. And it's one place where I've been called a Cartesian, actually, which is, of course, these days that's something like a bit an insult,
Yeah.
or at least
Yeah.
it's meant to be something like an insult. But
An
of course,
insult, yeah.
Descartes was a lot richer than we make him out to be. But
No doubt.
It was actually it was Dennett in a footnote who said he thought my view was right in terms of thinking that free will has to be about more than just those milliseconds that Libet is describing. But then he says, but the problem is Gallagher thought consciousness has something to do with it, and that's where he thought I was a Cartesian. But that whole lizard example, I thought, was an attempt to say how consciousness does come into play with questions having to do with free will, because it takes time. It's some things that are happening in the brain are happening at one time scale, but there's a time scale that relates to our experience, which goes is a little bit slower, you might say, or a little bit more extended. And in that time frame of our experience, and especially when memory gets into the game, that's where one should look for free will. And then I think if you really want to sort of change the terms and start talking about autonomy, then I think we also need to talk even longer time frames or time scales, and that would be time scales that allow us to think about social interactions and so forth. So the notion of autonomy that I like is really a feminist concept. Actually, one of your professors there, Professor Mackenzie, has done work in this respect on relational autonomy. And this is, I think, an idea that says, again, is very consistent with the idea of pragmatism, especially in someone like John Dewey, that we have to, in a certain way, achieve our autonomy. We achieve it through our interactions with others. We have a kind of freedom by degree, depending upon who we're interacting with, how we're interacting with people, the institutional settings within which we're interacting. Freedom is not an absolute, but it's something that comes by degree, and it depends upon our interactions with others. So there, I think that's a way to tell a bigger story about the notion of free will or autonomy.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. I mean, also, just for the listener, going back to this experiment, so kind of what you put out in the 5 steps is this notion that, okay, you're out somewhere in a field, a lizard touches your foot, and then immediately you have this like non-conscious reaction, oh, something touched my foot. But then afterwards, you register that it's a lizard, and then you make the decision, oh, I've got a lizard collection. I'm going to go and catch this lizard for my collection. And I mean, for me, I thought that was a beautifully outlined example, because like, it's, for me at least, as a human being just living life, when I think of free will, I try not to think of free will much, but when I do think of it, it's like, oh yeah, it's this like kind of intentionality to go and catch the lizard. And when I think of how I experience my life on a daily basis, it's that I make decisions and I intentionally, for better or worse, decide on things, and that's where I feel like I'm a free agent, an autonomous free agent. But yeah, that's fascinating, and also that's a really good connection. I don't think you talk of much of maybe you do, and I've just forgotten because I read this a while back. This how much the sociality and the then social world factors in the decisions you make, and that's certainly the case, and very enactivist too. Excellent.
Yeah.
Or a professor.
So
just seeing the intro. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, we can't take the idea that we are, totally free agents who are capable of making decisions, on our own. So that's a very individualistic conception, I think. And it's just that all gets balanced once you start thinking about sociality, institutions, and what, Bourdieu's notion of habitus, for example.
Habitus, yeah.
Habitus, and I've been working on some of this stuff, looking at Husserl's notion of sedimentation, where sedimentation has to do with, things that shape our way of thinking about the world, and that we inherit, that we gain from prior experience, or that we inherit, that gets instituted in institutions and social practices. And so there's a lot of stuff going on there that constrains, let's say, enables us to act in a free way, but also constrains that freedom. So again, we get a degree of freedom depending upon circumstances and situations and so forth.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'll also leave a link to your paper, your latest one, Habit, Sedimentation, and Institutions, in the show notes. I was going through it on the weekend, but I really didn't have any questions on that per se because I didn't read it that carefully. But no, I couldn't agree more. Especially, I would say here, you probably experience this quite a lot when you travel. In fact, I mean, it's just, again, this is what I love about phenomenology. It just pay attention to your lived experience, and you'll see a lot of the insights, make sense to you. How much, the factor of the environment plays into your most inner, what you would call your most inner private life, even. Fascinating. All right, Professor, just in the interest of time, if I may ask, is it okay if we go over time by about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, or?
Sure, that's fine.
Excellent, because I've got about 2 to 3 questions. One really important, the other two, if we have time, we'll get to it. Which is this chapter. So I would say, I mean, in the past few years, I too am fully an activist. Like, I've been fully convinced that there's something to the enactivist approach, and I try to, in my own thinking, be it in my work in AI or just, my interest in philosophy, I try to take the enactivist approach. But it's chapter 10. The only part that I'm still sort of battling or trying to really get my head around, or wrap my head around, is this idea of abstract thinking. And then in this book, in chapter 10, the last one, the practice of thinking, 10.4, you even talk about doing the math, which, perhaps this is true, is the most abstract thinking that a human being does, like in terms of especially advanced mathematics. And I could say, my background in computer science, in theoretical computer science especially, it is very abstract, but there's still, I don't know, if you really push it, there probably is still something embodied in how you think about even like algorithms and how, step by step kind of they go. But I don't know if you could say the same thing to mathematics. So anyway, this is a long-winded way of me asking, how would you explain something like the notion of abstract thinking through an enactivist lens?
Yeah, so that's part of what I was trying to do there, and other people have also tried to do this, and they've taken different approaches. I focus on the notion that thinking is a kind of practice, and that it's a practice that we can be skilled in, and that skill, to me, is in a certain way continuous with embodied processes. So if you look at performance studies, and talk about skilled performance, right? Bodily processes are very much included in that. And it's about how body and environment work together, or how what constitutes a skill, in any game or any athletic contest or any performing arts. It's always about the environment. It's always about the body, and we can tell a story all about that. But the idea is that what we find there are certain practices, and the idea that I have practiced doing things in order to gain skill in the performance. But I think we can just continue that story when it comes to higher order, or more, I think an activists like to say more complex cognitive processes that involve imagination, that involve memory, that involve mathematics, problem solving, and so forth. We can use similar notions that we use in sort of thinking about performance. We can use notions about affordances, for example, and think about, and people have started to talk about now about cognitive affordances. And in the book, I suggest, we sometimes use concepts as affordance, an affordance to solve a problem. In the same way that we might use a certain strategy if we're trying to solve a math problem. And we would say, well, this strategy will afford one way to solve the problem, or I could take this other way. I could, use a different practice in order to solve the problem. But it seems to me that the way of describing what we're doing when we're doing something like math problem solving is very similar to what we're doing in terms of adjusting the environment. And in some cases, when we do math, that's exactly what we're doing. We're using pencil and paper. We're drawing graphs. This goes back to Charles Sanders Peirce, his diagram, his idea that diagrams are really a kind of external way of thinking. The extended mind idea sort of was already there at Peirce in that respect. So how do we accomplish this higher order thinking or this more complex thinking? Oftentimes it's a kind of continuous process that we can relate to manipulating things out there in the environment, or starting to manipulate concepts in our head, so to speak. That seems very similar. We could have maybe imagined, what we do out here in the environment. We just kind of imagine doing it, and then that helps us to solve the problem. With the idea of the imagination also, I really like Gilbert Ryle's chapter in The Concept of Mind, if you're familiar with that. He has a chapter on imagination where he says the imagination really is grounded in bodily practices. So we look at how children start to imagine, and they might imagine in their play, they play at being a bear. And he says, well, what does that mean to imagine being a bear? It means the child starts gnashing its teeth and growling and, using claws. It's all about movement and action, taking action. And that's where imagination begins. And all that kind of manipulation that we do at the beginning when we start to think in a mathematical way, that also ties into movement and action, bodily action, which then sort of is the basis for more complex kinds of thinking. So that at least, there's a number, and I say a good number of people who are trying to make that argument in the book, and have pointed out the close connection between bodily movement, action, solving mathematical problems, and so forth. I think there's an argument there. Again, it's one way to try to solve that kind of scaling up problem. It's usually referred to. Other people have said, well, look, let's just look at the social processes involved. That, how do we do our thinking? And we can think oftentimes with other people in conversations. We can solve problems, or we can dream up ideas. We can discover new concepts. by having a conversation with someone, and something emerges from that wasn't there before. And of course, that's the basis of learning. And so we can start talking about scaling up on the basis of the kind of social interactions that we engage in, which are themselves bodily, gestural, all of that kind of set of practices that we engage in.
No doubt. I mean, in fact, I'm glad you mentioned social processes, because, I mean, if I could use an example here, I'm a software engineer, it's my day job, and I would say, no doubt, like the most important thing to becoming a good software engineer is pair programming, where you literally work on a problem with another engineer or programmer. And it's really odd, because it's something almost, if I could romanticize it, something almost sublime that happens, where when you're working on a problem with another person, in a way, your mind is in their mind and their mind is in your mind. It's there's like a synchrony that takes place. And I this is what I always say, like, I've been doing a bit of mentoring with some undergrads and some junior programmers. I tell them, if I know you can easily use an LLM and like get some code, but if you're learning to program, try your best to do it with others, do it with other people, be it your peers or perhaps a senior engineer. Because first of all, if it's a senior engineer, you will learn things as you pair program, but also in like a very fundamental sense, you can't think without having some affordance from another person, or even literally your computer. You program on your computer and you think while you're programming. It's not like you have the program in your head and then you go write it. You think while writing with your computer, or while writing the code. So yeah, there are some fascinating connections there. I think I would say, if I'm being honest, Professor Gallagher, the only part I struggle with is the mathematics bit, because at least I probably have a very naive understanding of mathematics, where I think, oh, it's just these genius professors like working on like abstract computation. But even with them, they would of course use a board or some kind of physical device to do their work, I assume, for their calculations. Excellent. All right, so yeah, go ahead, please.
I was saying, sitting in a PhD an economics seminar, PhD seminar, and it was beyond me. I mean, because it was highly mathematical, but I was working on a master's degree in economics, and I could follow conceptually what was happening, but I couldn't do the math. This guy, the teacher, was just up there on the board, and it looked like the mathematics were in his fingers or coming out of the chalk. This is totally, that's the way they thought. But they were thinking by writing on the board, and that was the kind of movement, the kind of action that they were engaged in. And it's not clear that they could just sit still and do that kind of thinking in any kind of prolonged and complex fashion.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, yeah, it takes a bit of, in a way, I mean, I guess you would call it a flow state, but when I do a bit of calculus and stuff just because I'm for the machine learning work. Obviously not in any way as advanced as what they'd be doing in university, but in a way, when you start interacting with her, just like, I mean, I've got my textbook right here, or just working on the thing, you get into like a flow state where you even don't realize how much of your thinking is sort of extended out to the world, be it a computer or like a piece of paper. So it's a really bizarre phenomena if you just reflect on it, to be honest. Excellent. All right. I mean, I had a question on this. There are two speculative questions, my last two questions really, but I had a question on, maybe you could just quickly comment on this. I mean, if it doesn't interest you, it's fine. Just the penultimate question would be, I'm curious, when I was reading Enactivism and even your book, have you thought of much of like this neo-materialist metaphysics with people like Karen Barad and all of that, like the vitalist philosophy, when it comes to, I mean, even in connection with like process philosophy of Whitehead and all of that? And as an enactivist thinker, do you find any affinity with like that kind of thinking when it comes to matter? This notion that, this almost the relational aspect of matter and of reality itself.
Okay, so some of what you were saying was broken up a little bit by the internet here, but I think I got it. So it's about process philosophy
Yes.
and Whitehead. Yes, definitely. I think to me, that's the sort of implication of enactivism, embodied processes. I find myself using the term process more and more. And I recently wrote a paper, which is Lambros Malaforis got me involved in a project. And so the paper is published in a archaeology journal, but it's about Whitehead and the notion of concrescence, his notion of concrescence in his process philosophy. And this, to me, is trying to outline a kind of enactive, embodied approach to the very act of digging in archaeological digs. And I was using Whitehead's notion of process there. But that's a different story. But I do think that, the whole notion of process is something important for the enactivist story. And that's a good way to think about all of the various things that we're trying to say, to try to put them into a kind of process type of approach. Yeah, I don't know what to call it, but a process
Yeah, I mean,
philosophy. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you could, almost like a Weltanschauung, or like even like a framework to view reality itself. And I just anyway, there's a lot to get into there too. But yeah, that is quite interesting because obviously when I was reading this dynamic approach between the mind and then the body and the environment, I couldn't help but think about some of process philosophy, or even this like vitalist philosophy that you see with people like Karen Barad and all of that. Excellent. All right, the last question, Professor, and this is a bit of a perhaps a controversial one, and I thought it'd be a fun note to end on. It's a bit of a socio-political question, and the reason I'm asking this is because obviously, we live in interesting times, especially in your country, in the US, and I was thinking, apropos enactivism. I mean, in our culture, we hear a lot about this, like the liberal notion of the individual. Everything has to be centered around the individual, right? Like my rights. It's about me. Even when these conversations about privacy and all of these big topics, it's always about the individual. And yeah, I mean, in a way, I too think of, because I live in this world and in my environment, I too very much have an individualistic approach to how I think of things. Although I try to be very careful about that too. But so let me just ask plainly, in the enactivist approach, or using the enactivist lens, does it leave space for something like this, the liberal notion of an individual?
That's a good question. Short answer, I think, is yes. We are talking quite frequently about agents who are embodied agents who are taking actions. But I think the enactivist wants to stress that that agent is always within some context, some environment in which social practices, institutional structures will have an effect upon the agent. So where should we start on that story? And there are some who recommend starting with the social and working our way back to talking about an individual. Because from the very beginning, if we look at the developmental psychology, from the very beginning, we are social creatures. We are totally immersed. Merleau-Ponty has this phrase. He says, "We are born into a whirlwind of language." We hear even before we're born. Late-term fetus can hear the sounds of its mother's voice. can recognize its mother's voice. So there have been experiments on that. But so we're born into a social structure, and from the very beginning, we're being raised in that social structure, for better or for worse. And so if we start there, then the question is, how do we achieve individuality? I think that's a better way to start. And then not to start with, okay, let's start with the individual and define the individual in an isolated fashion as what it is, but rather start with a social beginning and try to see how the individual wins its autonomy, from its social relations.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I mean, I would even say here where I find deep affinity with even like the Hegelian philosophy, where in a way the self, the individual, it's something you become, and you become that socially. And I hate when Hegel even speaks of like freedom as like a social freedom. And I find that, yeah, I would say, yeah, I'm also glad that we still do leave place for an individual, because I also don't want to get into like this like new age kind of everything is consciousness, the self doesn't exist. I mean, I know that non-dual thinking, there's a place for it, but I mean, the way I always joke around with my partner is like, why is it that if I just walk on the street and just touch someone's face, why would they get offended, right? I mean, if we are all just consciousness, why can't I just touch someone's face? But there has to be a bit more of a deeper way of thinking about that. But yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's like don't start with the individual. Like there's a place for the individual, but then try to figure out how does one become an individual. With time, using for sure things like developmental psychology. That was lovely. This has been a complete privilege. Thank you so much, Professor Gallagher. I've learned a lot, and again, when I'm re-listening, I'll leave resources to all of the papers and thinkers you mentioned in the show notes. This has been truly an honor. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Okay, Rahul, and thank you for the interview.